Strokes are no longer the preserve of older people. The rate of stroke hospitalisations amongst younger people has increased by nearly 50% since 2007. Now, studies suggest young women are more at risk than young men due to the increased risks associated with birth control pills and pregnancy. For more insight on this, we're joined by Dr. Vuyiswa Mandita, who's a neurologist. Thank you very much for your time this morning, Doctor. And it's an important topic because it's a worrying trend that has becoming more and more evident and prominent amongst young people. Why are we seeing such an increased rate of strokes in South Africa amongst the country's young people?
You know, thank you so much for having me, first of all. So much of the stroke landscape has changed in the sense that we've always been used to males over 55 being commonly having strokes. And in that age group, it remains black males who have them. But in the younger age group, it seems that women do have them. Birth control is not the only cause. You know, it's things like autoimmune diseases, our lifestyles, the fact that they're sedentary, we don't eat well. So I think there are so many contributing factors to the fact that strokes have now become so prevalent in young people.
And maybe just explain to us what exactly a stroke is. What happens when you are experiencing a stroke?
So basically, a stroke is when a section of your brain usually stops having blood supply. And that happens mostly because of a clot, or what we call a thrombus. And sometimes it's due to a brain bleed. So it's the factors that affect the blood vessels, the thickness of the blood, that will then predispose a person to strokes. Commonly, it's things like high blood pressure because of what it does to the integrity of the blood vessels, the diabetes because it's so toxic to them, as well as cholesterol. But in the younger age group, we find that conditions that are pro-clotting, such as birth control pills, such as autoimmune conditions, are the ones that will then predispose us to strokes.
Are there any symptoms, Doc? Can I feel when I'm about to have a stroke?
You know, the symptoms are so vast that, you know, I don't know if you are familiar with this FAST principle that has always been spoken about when we speak strokes. You know, so we usually say if suddenly, you know, emphasis on if there's a sudden change in F being your face being droopy all of a sudden, arms and legs being weak, your speech being abnormal, and T stands for how, you know, the fact that we have to act so quickly when the stroke occurs. So the symptoms largely depend on the part of the brain that's affected or that is starved of blood supply at the time. So as a rule of thumb, if anybody's neurological status changes, i.e. the way they walk, the way their face looks, the fact that they're weak on one side, the way they speak, or their understanding of speech, or sometimes even vision, that is a stroke until proven otherwise. It has to be acted on quickly, because if somebody arrives at an appropriate facility within time, that is within 3 to 4 hours, we can actually do something about it and change the prognosis.
What about the effects, short-term and the long-term effects? We had one of South Africa's stars, Lera, experience a stroke, and it was communicated that her voice was impacted. We have other people who experience paralysis on one or the other side of their bodies. Talk us through these effects that come from a stroke, and whether there is hope that there is a chance of full recovery, or if there are long-term effects.
So usually we have the face being affected on one side and the body being affected on one side. So the most common presentation would be somebody arriving with weakness or paralysis on one side. But you can also have imbalance or abnormal sensation on one side, or, you know, where half your visual field is affected as well. So as long as there's a change in neurological status, then it could be a stroke. And I think it's important for people to know that the presentation of a stroke is so vast. It's not just the paralysis on one side that we're used to. Sometimes it's just a matter of understanding speech that sleeps quickly.
No, absolutely. And then obviously in terms of treatment and medication, do we have that kind of thing when it comes to the treatment of strokes? How does that process work?
Yeah, I say that if I could shout anything from the mountaintops, it would be that we need to get to an appropriate facility quickly, because what we can do in that time for most people is actually change whether they'll have a disability or not, or the extent even of the disability. So if one arrives at a facility within 3 hours, I'd say 3 to 4 hours, we can act where we give drugs that will actually break down the clot if it is a stroke that comes from a clot. So most people would qualify for that. There are some people, because it is a treatment that comes with risks of bleeding, that don't qualify for the treatment. But if you are on time, we can literally change the fate from somebody being able to walk for the rest of their life and not being able to walk for the rest of their life. So what we do in that first 3 hours literally determines what your life looks like going forward. And I find that this is something a lot of people don't know, and I think it's really important that we know it, so that we can prevent disability, so that we can prevent death.
Right, and of course there are some unfortunate instances where people don't have access to healthcare facilities in the time that you've spoken about. In the absence of that, sure. Doc, talk us through ways in which we can take care of ourselves a little better so as to lessen the chances of us suffering from a condition like a stroke.
Like with all things, prevention is better than cure. So if, we need to watch what we eat. We need to not have a sedentary lifestyle. We always advise neuro patients that, 30 minutes of cardio, minimum of 3 times a week, can do a lot for the brain. We need to do regular checks on blood pressure, diabetes, cholesterol, because those are the things that silently lead up to a stroke. And in the younger population, in addition to that, if you're going to start birth control, it must be under the advice of a doctor, and you must have been thoroughly screened by your gynae for complications such as clots and strokes. If you have an autoimmune condition, you need to see the appropriate specialist, so that if you are a high risk for stroke, we can put you on medication such as aspirin daily to thin the blood enough to prevent strokes. So I think it's a matter of us taking care of our health, us regularly checking where we are in terms of our health, and then keeping it when we have it.
No, absolutely. Dr. Vuyiswa Mandita, thank you very much for joining us this morning. Some very interesting insights there provided by the doctor as a neurologist about strokes, that worrying trend that we're seeing in that more and more young people are getting strokes, and then talking us through the ways in which we could better take care of ourselves so as to prevent something that could change one's life forever.